Hello, writers, workout participants, and fans, and those that are here to learn a little bit more about writing flash fiction. This is going to be 5 ways to use setting in your flash fiction. Fat with setting. In a flash narrative, there often isn't space to take on every element of fiction, so a tiny story might be fat with poeticism, fat with character, fat with setting, fat with symbols, but not fat with all of them. Flash fictions offer us depth over breadth, fat with substance, as playwright August Wilson used to describe his plays, fat with substance, even while being made of less substance. This is a quote by Rion Amilcar Scott. And for us today in this video, for our own education on how we can use setting in Flash, we are going to look at stories that are fat with setting, that have chosen to give setting more emphasis, more space in their stories. Why care about establishing a dynamic setting? Why do we need a place to put these stories? Here's a quote by Dorothy Allison. Place is often something you don't see because you're so familiar with it that you devalue it or dismiss it or ignore it. But in fact, it is the information your reader most wants to know. We all want to go someplace else. We want to visit other cultures, other venues, places that take us far or maybe even closer to where we are now. Remember that your reader hasn't been there, or if they have, they want to see it in a new way through the perspective of your main character or narrator. One of the fundamentals of flash fiction is that it takes the reader into a new kind of experience. It breaks with the tradition. It gives us a world that may be a little slant version of what we already are in so that we can see it in a new way. We love writing that takes us into new places and gives us new perspectives. Flash relies so much on atmospheric moments that to disregard the setting is to weaken the effect of the Flash structure container. To fully use the power of compression is to never let the reader float, to keep them on the stage of the story, focusing their attention on the menu of or the minutia of the action of the characters. Setting is a way to make sure that the reader knows exactly where the characters are at and how the setting can impact the main character's world. So, in our 5 things that we're going to look at for setting, and there are many other things that settings can do to sharpen or increase the depth and resonance of flash fiction, but I picked these 5 just to kind of get us started. So, number 1, it establishes the stage of the story. I know there are some Flash writers that hearken Flash to being more like poetry and the obsession of poetry on an image or a thought or an idea, and the idea of heightening the language to really express some kind of new feeling or new idea or new tension. But I often also think of Flash as being kind of like a stage play. We, the reader, witness the characters on the stage. We do not necessarily get to be inside their heads the way a novel would work. We get to see them acting and reacting, and from that, we must make inferences and judgments as the reader. That's kind of how the writer and reader join together to make flash fiction work, especially when we have said and unsaid. So, establishing the stage of the story, stories need to take place somewhere, so the reader is properly orientated to the time and place as well as the outside pressure that might exist. I struggle with stories that open up with me not knowing where I am or what time period is or what the main culture of the characters might be. It makes me feel like I'm floating, and I'm already floating so much in my own world. These details make the worlds of our stories feel concrete. They create the physical stage on which the action takes place. And we often want something, some kind of container for knowing where these characters are going to be in the story. So here are 2 examples. My parents are in the backyard digging their graves. I'm in the kitchen with Orange, my younger brother, and we're watching through a grubby little window. I love how this sets up two kind of stages for the story. We've got the parents out in the backyard doing something that we would not expect them to be doing. And then we have our main character, our first person point of view here with her brother watching through the window. So they are there to witness this kind of unusual activity from the parents. I'm instantly intrigued to see what happens and to see if these characters cross through the stages that they're set up for in the beginning. And a second example, when I go in, the sink is bursting with unwashed dishes, coated with moldy leftover scraps, half-filled glasses, cups that balance precariously on the counter rim, ripped open TV dinner boxes thrown on top. There isn't room for me to set aside the cleaned dishes. Here we have a character that is in their parents' home. We have very specific descriptions. It's very concrete. It's very sensory. We have very easily visualized objects. And though this is a mess, it is a very particular mess to these characters. And it's a very particular mess that this point of view character is having to deal with as kind of the central conflict. And we're right there experiencing this story with the main character from the very beginning, which I love. So, number two in our journey of five establishes a character's perspective. Another way to reveal the nature of our main characters is to establish the world around them through how they perceive this world. We will come to know and love and root for these characters as they make themselves individual, unique, and specific. We're not just reading about any characters, we are reading about the main character in this story in this moment. The setting often provides objects, sensory details, and the opportunity to use metaphor to say the unsayable. Flash fiction, in its way like poetry, is always kind of attempting to say the unsayable. Each character should have a unique way of taking in the world, the setting of the story, and should be influenced by this unique perspective. It's why we come to care about them in such a very short amount of space in the word count or in time that it takes to read. We are not going to be with them for 300 to 400 pages, probably just 1 to 3 pages. So, what can the writer do to make us feel like we know who these characters are? Flash fiction, even in its limited word count, can transport us to new realms by focusing on the main character's perspective. It's not just what they see or sense, but how they perceive it in the moment of the story that gives the setting the ability to do more than just provide a backdrop. Our characters are not just cameras on a wall. They are interacting and reacting with the things that are around them. Characters, objects, setting. Characters will have fresh ways of revealing themselves when they have a new setting to interact with. So, consider if you're telling a story and it feels like the same old story, maybe put that story in a different setting. Allow the character to be kind of that fish out of water again and let us see how they are re-interacting with a new kind of setting. The main character and how they filter details and the senses create the stage of the story. The quicker the stage is established, the sooner the character can act on that stage. No stage and the actions are without context. How can you have a ghost story if you don't have a place to put the ghost or for the ghost to interact with the place that they are in? So here we will take a look at In Case of an Emergency by Linda Niehoff. And here is a paragraph that shows us how the character is giving their perspective to us in this moment that they have come upon a hotel in the middle of a long journey. I finally stopped at the smallest motel I could find and fed quarters into the Coke machine. I love that they are not going to the front desk, they're not signing in, they're not asking if there's any room. Like, all of this is pretty typical. I love how Niehoff here skips right to the moment of a character doing an action that's a little bit different than what we would expect. Now I'm watching the electric blue light rippling from the pool. There aren't any trees out here, so you can see to the end of things. Lightning flashes, still far off. It's pink and jagged, the kind you see in photographs on bank calendars. Here is a very clear way of how this character thinks about the world, how they express their perspective by telling us that what they are seeing outside of this hotel reminds them of photographs on bank calendars. It's a very unique and individual way of looking at the world. That nighttime shot with a distant farm along the edge, and that one long jag of lightning reaching all the way down. This writer has put us directly into the mind of the character. Everything that we see, hear, smell, sense, visualize is coming from their perspective. It allows us to experience the story along with the main character. Number three establishes metaphor and figurative language. One of the hallmarks of flash fiction is that it uses language that is heightened, that asks a little bit more of the reader, that allows the reader to consider the said and unsaid and the unsayable. Novels, especially genre novels like thrillers and suspense, does not have time to heighten the language, and therefore that language is usually kind of spare. It may not be the absolute best writing in the world, but Flash kind of really wants you to give it your best go. And one way, or a few ways to do that, is to think about metaphor and figurative language, and giving us the sense that the words have more meaning than just their simple meaning on the page. Setting is also a great place to find imagery to build metaphors and figurative language. It helps us focus on the world rather than the character's physical traits or the clothing they are wearing, unless it is important to the story. Because Flash does not have room, especially to add words in where novels can go on forever, we often don't get descriptions of characters' physical traits or their clothing because it usually just isn't as important to the story. So here we want to give a sense of what the character is experiencing, even if they don't quite know how to say it, through figurative language and metaphor. Flash writers rely on the reader to build images of the character based on the language that is filtered through the main point of view, and this is deepened by the figurative language that is inspired by the world inhabited by the characters. We don't get a description of the character from Niehoff's story, the one in the hotel that we talked about before this, but we have a sense of who they or he might be, could be she, might be, based on how they see the world and a few of their small actions. Here we have a story, Cleave by Olga Dermot Bond. It is published in New Flash Fiction Review. Um, Hopefully, I want to be able to read the whole thing too. Hopefully, my share screen will continue as I click on it. Cleave by Olga Dermot Bond. Before anything else, the mottled smell of blood and sawdust from across the street. I used to watch him work, offer to do the early shift, even in the winter, setting out vegetable crates, winding open the canopy like a sad circus tent, just so I could gaze all morning. His cleaver was hung up behind the counter, a bladed Bible he reached for again and again, the slam of its weight against sinew, bone, to create a window display. Cathedral roof of spare ribs, soft prayer of liver and kidneys, hearts slumped in tiny white plastic bags, animal Valentine. And I love that paragraph, the way that it stretches the metaphor. We have Bible, we have cathedral, we have prayer. All of those are religious words that have been adapted or added to this action of butchering, and how that gives the words a different tint in this context. The first time I went inside, his apron was stained with terracotta fingerprints and a line like a darkening horizon beneath his waist. The momentary rush of cold from freezers beyond gleaming cabinets, carcasses swaying like ruined grand pianos just out of sight. After we kissed, I knew it was trouble, love like a bitten lip. He sensed my desire, blood risen and scarlet sneaked me in those Wednesday afternoons when the shop shut early, the bell jangling silly, the arc of my back when he pressed me against the till, the hunger of it all. He never looked at me after, so when Thursdays came garlic bulbs scolded me, their varicose bodies bulging with indignation at my stupidity as I tied them silent to ropes with lemons. I displaced so many afternoons arranging strange forests of celeriac, shushing bodies of baby mushrooms who doze perfectly in their baskets. Everything in this story is more than what it is when you would pick it up at the grocery store. Come closing time, I would wait for him to call, then sleep alone. I dreamt he had cleaved me beautifully apart, arranged me naked in the glass counter, besides butterfly joints and marbled steak, with sprigs of parsley, bay leaves, and thyme in my hair. Metaphor just allows us to make richer, deeper stories with less words. It allows the reader to have a sense of the play of the language, and it makes us sit up and pay attention. Number four, setting can establish what your character values. There is this idea, and I think it's a good one, that the more that we write about something or the more that we focus on something, the more the writer or the main character, in this case, if it's through their perspective, is showing that they value it. In Flash, it's not always necessarily that there is more words. It can just be the importance or the gravitas that is kind of given to it as we read it. Settings often show us the value that a character attributes to a certain place, and this value helps to reveal the character and often the central conflict of the story. In this story, What Remains by D.W. McKinney, it is a story about a character who is thinking about her relatives, I think her grandparents' house, and all the time that was spent at that house, but now the house has been sold or will be sold, and the narrator is thinking about how much they love the house and what they can remember of the house and how the memories are all that they kind of have left. So here is the second paragraph where McKinney really lays down the setting for us, and we can see how much the narrator values this place. The earth is exposed and muddy brown. The sun has chased the grass to the far corners of the yard. Tufts lay huddled along the fence line, spitting out planks like rotten teeth. But I can still feel the Kentucky bluegrass underneath my feet. Right? There are issues, but the narrator doesn't care about the issues. The stiff blade served as a wedding altar for my mother and stepfather. The grass cradled tangerines when I stripped them from the trees and they rolled from my hands. The once unending blanket of green caressed my stomach as my first child poked her way forward from inside me. Look at some of the words we've got: cradled, caressed, feeling grass underneath the feet. It's good enough to be a wedding altar, right? This is a place that has value for this character. This character has taken the time to show us through their perspective and the details and even a little bit of metaphor to show us how important this place is. So the more that you take your time and slow down and really describe a place through the perspective of your character, the more the reader will understand the importance of the setting. They will see how the character values this place. In a story about the loss of a generational home, McKinney pauses the story in the second paragraph to provide us context by assigning value to the setting, by heightening the language, by showing us how the narrator feels about this space, how connected she is to it, so that we can feel her loss. We feel her loss. She doesn't tell us. There are no words of sadness, no words of like, I felt like this, right? It's just through the experience that the narrator is relaying to the reader. Second paragraphs in stories, especially Flash, often dip into backstory or backfill in order to catch the reader up to speed, to provide context to help us make meaning from the character's conflict or struggles. Since Flash is all about breaking the traditional narrative structure, it's great when we get some other kind of rhetorical approach. And McKinney uses sensory details to highlight the setting to great effect here. There is a little bit of backstory within these descriptions, but they're not just summaries of what happened. They are the way that the character or characters felt while those things were happening. And last but not least, and again, there are so many ways that we can use setting, these are just 5 of them. It establishes defamiliarization. And defamiliarization really is just making the normal strange and the strange normal so that we see the world in a new way, so that we're opened up to new possibilities, new empathies, new ways of thinking, experiencing um, life. So now we're going to work on our defamiliarization, the process of making the familiar strange, fresh, resonant. And what is resonance if not a moment of revelation for the reader? I love when I'm reading and the writer has found a way to show me a world differently, to show me ways that characters can act in ways that I didn't necessarily expect or understand. Often that is the job of the reader. If I can butcher the Kafka quote, right? Our writing is to be the axe that breaks open the frozen pond. Um, and so hopefully Flash is attempting to do that. We see the world anew when we are faced with new rules, cultures, and experiences of place. A new place is just the friction we need to add new tension, to twist the emotional knob, to make the feelings fresh. Stories set in the usual places with the usual concepts or situations are too easily classified and labeled, and we want to create the ineffable, the mysterious, the unnameable, and we talked earlier about the unsayable. We want stories that are more than their summaries, that must be read, pondered, and felt by the reader. I think it is Flannery O'Connor who said that, like, if you could summarize a story, then maybe the story wasn't as deep as maybe you thought on the surface. That stories often, the best ones, are unsummarizable. That they have elements that there's just no way to summarize. You should just read the story to enjoy it. So here we're going to look at Wedding Party Moved to the Cemetery at Midnight. It's a 100-word story by Joshua Michael Stewart. And I think this example here is close to the full story. Let me make sure. No, here's a full story. Hopefully you'll be able to see this on the video when I switch. If not, I'm going to read it for you. Wedding party moved to the cemetery at midnight. The bride floats between the stones. Her groom plays dead for an iPhone camera. Laughter spills from mouths sweet with spirits. A plaid blazer dances with a pearl necklace. The groom plants a fat kiss on his new wife's lips under a marble angel with a chipped wing. The trills of spring peepers serenade the souls and all the plastic flowers. And the departed do not weep, harping on their marriages to stillness. Instead, they sing Obla Di, Obla Da in their NYC apartment sized plots, happy to be invited. It's been so long since any of them have been to a party. So what I love about this story is that it takes place, a wedding taking place in a cemetery is just this weird foreign idea. But Stewart, in such a small space, makes me feel like I'm right there with them. We've got just the little changes, right? The bride floats between the stones. That doesn't happen at a traditional wedding. But we can imagine or visualize it as she is coming through the graveyard. Her groom acting maybe inappropriately, playing dead for the camera, and laughter spills from mouths with spirits. We have all these kind of like ghostly words that make sense in a graveyard that might not make sense in a wedding, but they make perfect sense here. And I love this line here, kind of in the middle, that makes a metaphor out of people. A plaid blazer dances with a pearl necklace. If you visualized it straight for the way that it's written, or like the logical part, it doesn't compute that a blazer is dancing with a necklace. But we know that this is a certain person wearing a blazer and a certain woman wearing a necklace. And for me, that just kind of broke open the story. That use of metaphor. I also love that there's a marble angel with a chipped wing, right? This is saying something beyond like what the plot is saying or what the characters are doing. If there's a chipped wing, it kind of denotes that maybe this wedding in this moment is going great, but will it in the future, right? As history or time passes. And then we have this idea of the departed, the ones that are there in the grave, being able to witness this experience um, as we are experiencing it. So it kind of combines the reader with a certain character, which gives it kind of a voyeuristic view. I'm not bored by the traditional wedding. All the time there are shows and they do weddings, and if they go off perfectly the way all weddings want to be done perfectly, it can be kind of boring. So you expect something to be different, and one way to do that is to put your characters in a different setting than you would expect, and it allows the enhancement of figurative language and the enhancement of what the characters might be doing. So, in summary, setting in flash fiction has a way of making each word count because it does so much to enhance all the other craft moves and elements. Everything kind of twins together with setting to give it a stage so that we, the reader, can experience the actions of the story along with the characters. We want to be a part of that experience if possible. Changing the setting can be a great way to revise a story that isn't quite working. It can wake up the main character and add a different or more heightened pressure on them to act. Boring characters often arise out of boring settings because there are no new pressures on them to act or react, and therefore they don't reveal much or enough about themselves to the reader in these common scenarios or settings because they're doing common things. They feel like common characters, and we want main characters. We want individual, unique, specific characters. Changing the setting can help create new plots and new ways to reveal your characters. And last here, minor changes in the conventional and character plot or setting can create fresh and resonant stories. So don't be afraid to go past the usual or the expected. Charles Baxter often talks about stories are best when they break rituals. And flash fiction is great for giving us that flash of a moment in a character's life, the one where the ritual has finally been broken. And because of that, they will act in ways that they have not acted before because of the pressure of the conflict. And we will get to see their true character or their true nature. And setting is one way to kind of put that pressure on these characters. And then last but not least, here are some ways that you can contact me if you want to learn more about kind of the way I see flash fiction working. So thank you so much for being here for my writer's workout video. I hope that this inspires you to use setting in different ways in your flash fiction, your nonfiction, maybe even your novels. Thank you so much for listening, and happy writing.